What does it mean to wake up? In a way, it means to continue the arc of human development without ever stopping. That there's actually no end to that process. And how do we understand that no end that is the full development of human consciousness and what it has to offer? And if we're going to follow a path, a set of practices that's going to help us, then what is the everyday path? What is the path that you and I can actually take? Not something that we have to research in the laboratory. What's something that's available to you? And what's available to us as shaky, vulnerable human beings? Because this is where it matters, right? This is the other part. If we're going to talk about the word that we're not supposed to talk about, which is love tonight, we also have to talk about vulnerability. That's one of the great ways in which we're held, supported, and encouraged as human beings when we're cared for. And so what is the path of a shaky, vulnerable human being, which means us? Is there someone that doesn't fit that category, by the way, here? If you don't, you can leave. Because the rest of this won't make any sense to you. It won't matter. But if you're an ordinary, vulnerable, shaky human being at times, and you're interested in the expression of your full potential, then there is a path that is available to you that the research in mind really supports. And there's a story we can go back to the beginning of the story. In northern India, when Siddhartha Gautama was a young renunciate, he had left the palace that he lived in. Many of you know this story. He was a prince. But he wasn't convinced that he understood what life was about. He snuck out of the palace in which he was very well protected, and he saw someone who's ill, someone who's old, someone who has died, and he wanted to understand this thing that he'd never seen before. And he studied with everyone he could, all the teachers of his day, and he mastered apparently all the techniques. They said he was kind of a spiritual genius, but it didn't answer his question about why do we suffer and what can we do about it. And using the sort of ascetic, self-renunciate kind of pathways that were available to him at the time, he lay down on the side of a stream one day, not this one's in northern England. But it's a nice image to go with the story. Nearly dead, certainly exhausted from the kind of practices, the self-denying practices. And there was a young woman, Sujati, walking along the path going to a temple, and she had an offering. Sweet cream and rice that she was going to take to the temple, it was a Hindu temple. And she saw this fellow by the side of the stream that looked ill, in need, emaciated. And instead of going to the temple, she went to him and she said, "Please eat this. It'll help you. You look like you're in trouble." If it was happening down here on the Riverwalk, we're like, "Dude, you look bad. You know, you need something." And he decided at that moment to take some nourishment. In fact, it says he understood the middle way. One of the stories indicates that as a boat went down the river, someone was playing a tune that was very beautiful. And he thought, oh, if the strings are too loose, there's no music. But if they're too tight, they break. What's the middle way? And so he took food, he was nourished, and began to focus himself on the meditation that ultimately led to his awakening. So really the start of the whole Buddhist path did not begin with philosophy, or she did not implore him with some theological discourse. It was basically just simple human kindness. The entire transformation of this one person, and in some ways of our world, started with this one act of just human kindness and generosity. Arnold Toynbee was asked at the end of the 19th century, what do you think is going to be one of the biggest things in the 20th century that will shape history? And he said, the introduction of Buddhism to the West. That there's something about understanding this kind of path that's very, very powerful. What the Buddha did when she was kind is he sat down under a tree and he sat in silence and stillness, and he began to be a researcher. but he was a researcher in a way that sometimes we don't think of as research. What does a researcher do? Has a question, engages in some sort of investigation with some sort of tool, gathers data, and then checks that data with other people who've used those tools or those methods to see if they match. Fair enough? Okay. So if you're a scientist like he was, the tool that you use is meditation. You know, if you're an astronomer, you use a tool called a telescope. You can see things, you can get data, you can match with what other people get. If you're a heart specialist, you need to use the tools of an electrocardiogram, get information. But if you're a mystic and you want to do research, you have to learn how to meditate. And you do get data, and you can check it with other people who have done those things. So the place he looked was into actually the life that he had. And this is what's important. Every single one of you sitting in this room today has all of the necessary ingredients for awakening. You have a body, a mind, you have the weight of your own conditioning and history, all the things that a life has. And that's what he looked into, and by looking deeply into his own life, not to the heavens, not to theology, not to something esoteric, into his own life, he was able to begin to wake up.